And we will kick things off. Good evening. Alexis Harrison here with CT 169 Strong. Um, as most of you know, we're an all-volunteer, nonpartisan group dedicated to informing the residents on the many zoning and housing bills facing our legislator. We're getting towards the end of the legislative session, so we want to take another opportunity to educate everyone on what's going on. We have some great guests tonight, and we are having some technical issues, so hopefully a few others will be popping on. We have State Senator Jeffrey Gordon, who represents the Woodstock area in the quiet corner of Connecticut, northwestern Connecticut. We also have Francis Pickering, who is Executive Director of WestCog. Great to see you guys tonight.
Good evening.
Now, Francis, I'm going to kick things off with you. I want to start off with the fair share bill. There have been many issues with this one, issues with environmental protection, the cityification of the suburbs, the extreme budgetary impact it will have on our local municipalities and communities, and just, the lack of input on the implementation of it. Just a few concerns I want to highlight are the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities Director of Public Policies was in opposition of this bill because he said it imposes a top-down policy onto the backs of local governments. Can you explain what the fair share bill is, how it will impact our communities, especially with the budgetary issue, because that's something that keeps coming up a lot?
Sure.
And where we are in the process.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Alexis, for the invitation to come here tonight. We are a nonpartisan group at the COG, and we strongly support affordable housing. And this year, as every year, there are good bills, there are bad bills, and there are ugly bills. And just to be clear, there are good housing bills out there. I would categorize this as an ugly housing bill. Fair share is a bill that would require the state to determine the need for affordable housing in every community statewide, which in principle sounds like a good idea, but it presumes that the state understands exactly what the need is. The sponsors of the bill, the Open Communities Alliance, have released a spreadsheet showing how many units would be built under fair share, their estimate in every community. And their estimates are relatively, I would say, detached from market demand and need in many parts of the state. They call for the construction of dozens to hundreds of units in municipalities where there has been little to no demand. Now, that is not necessarily southwestern Connecticut, but a town like Union, Connecticut, whose population has grown 3% in 200 years, would have to build dozens of units. Now, what's interesting about fair share is that under the proposal, every town, the state would determine how many units are needed in every town, at what income levels, with what number of bedrooms, what age of the residents, and whether owned or rented units. So it's very prescriptive in that regard. And then the municipalities would have to develop, every municipality except for Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, Bridgeport, New Britain, and Wyndham would have to develop a fair share plan within 1 year. And that plan will lay out how those units will be built within 10 years. Fair share calls for building 121,000 housing units in 10 years. That's enough to house 300,000 people. There's no reason to believe Connecticut's population will grow that fast. Our population has been relatively slow growing or stagnant. Not that that's a good thing, but that's just the reality. And if a municipality does not adopt the plan, then they are subject to default zoning, which is 20 units per acre by right, so no special permits, everywhere where there's public water and sewer, and where there's no public water and sewer, essentially no maximum density except what is limited environmentally and in terms of public health. A lot of people have been concerned about the default zoning. I'm personally not so concerned about that because I think every municipality facing that specter would adopt a fair share plan. What's really concerning in the bill to me is that it puts the responsibility for housing creation on municipalities. So the bill provides extraordinary standing before the court for Open Communities Alliance and their partners to sue municipalities if the housing goals are not met within 3, 5, or 10 years. So if 121,000 units are not built in 10 years statewide, then every municipality that fails to meet their fair share goal, even if the cause of the units not being built, for instance, is a recession and demand dries up, or there's inadequate tradespeople to build it, or mortgage rates are too high, lending rates are too high for developers to have an interest, or there's been no population growth for 200 years. If a municipality fails to build those units, they can be sued and forced by the courts to build them at public expense. And that's really, I want to underline that. This is not like 830G, where a developer can take a town to court and have the zoning set aside to build at his or her own expense. This is going to court and saying, I don't care what happened. Maybe there's no demand. Maybe there's a recession. The units weren't built. I'm going to sue the town. I'm going to collect lawyers' fees as I sue the town. And I'm going to force the town to enter into an agreement with developers to build these units. And now in some towns there may be demand, but we haven't built 120,000 units per decade in Connecticut in 40 plus years. This is an unrealistic rate. We probably don't even have the tradespeople to build it. Definitely not the demand. And the fair share goals, in my view, are unrealistic. They are setting towns up to fail. It's really a green light for advocacy organizations to have a field day in court, suing municipalities, winning lawyers' fees, and forcing construction. And the most disturbing thing about it is that it doesn't even respond to the needs of the people who are currently struggling to pay their mortgages or rents right now. Instead of helping them out, it says, look, we built a brand new housing unit of taxpayer expense somewhere else in the state, and maybe you can move there. Our estimate, and it's a very conservative estimate of the cost of fair share, is that it will cost $20 billion, which will be borne fully on the backs of local governments, which means by taxpayers. And that equates to a 20% increase in property taxes statewide. That would make Connecticut number one at something. Unfortunately, something ignominious, but we would be number one in the effective property tax burden in the entire country. We'd pull ahead of New Jersey, which is the inspiration for fair share. And that's what's so concerning to us is if we look at the taxes in Connecticut, the property tax is by far the largest tax. It's a very regressive tax. And raising it even further actually works against housing affordability and works against economic growth and equity in Connecticut. So we think it's a really bad policy, and we hope that the General Assembly agrees.
Thank you. That's a very thorough explanation. Thank you. I want to move to Senator Gordon. Now, Woodstock is a very small town. And according to, let me back up here, sorry. So actually, I don't think we really have many details on how the fair share would work if it passes. I mean, the modeling that we have is based on the bill's proponent, Open Communities Alliance, and that indicates that Woodstock could add as many as 260 affordable units over the next 10 years. So if developers build them, they would have to build about 2,000 units because only a portion of them would have to be affordable, as I understand it. So more total housing units must be built in order to satisfy that quota. So how would Woodstock, a very small town, the quiet corner, a farming community, how would that accommodate as many as 2,000 new housing units built over the next 10 years or so? In terms of budget, open space, sewer capacity, farm retention, budgets for municipal workers like fire, police, and whatnot. Can you give us a viewpoint on that?
Sure, happy to do so. And I wear two hats. For the past 16 years, I've been chairman of Woodstock's Planning and Zoning Commission. So I know this inside and out as far as how, things are at a town level trying to deal with affordable housing, attainable housing, how all these things actually impact at the local level. I also wear the other hat of being a state senator, 13 towns in Northeast Connecticut. That includes Woodstock, and it also includes Union, the smallest town, 781 people. And the vast majority of the towns in Northeast Connecticut are rural. They don't have a lot of infrastructure. I can tell you in Woodstock, we don't have public water. We have a small little section of public sewer, but really no public sewer. And we actually have a sewer avoidance policy. In a lot of the small towns, we don't have the type of infrastructure at all to support this type of building of affordable housing. It's one of the reasons why, despite a lot of good efforts on the part of rural towns, small towns, to encourage affordable housing, developers just don't come because there's really no market value there. And let alone if people wanted to move to some of the small towns, where are the jobs? There really are not compared to other parts of the state. And also, there isn't much in the way of public transportation in a lot of the towns, which is important when you're talking about affordable housing. So that for the towns to be able to sustain this, I can tell you, knowing the towns in my Senate district very well, there's just no way these small towns are going to be able to afford it. My concern is, and I've seen, the rollout over several legislative sessions of fair share and other things, is that the state is really setting up the small towns, the rural towns, to fail. Maybe it's by design and on purpose, so the state says it has to come in and take over. But more and more, these types of top-down mandates never work. We see what happened in New Jersey, which is mired in years of litigation in the court system to try to deal with what it's tried to enact and hasn't been successful. And the other is, it's just amazing to me that all of these efforts are being focused on quote unquote affordable housing. And I support affordable housing very much. In fact, I've helped create affordable housing plans in my town and really look at what I consider realistic affordable housing, not 830G strict definitions, but in the real world for each of our towns. And we have 169 municipalities in Connecticut. Each one is different and unique. What really is truly affordable? What is actually attainable? The state definitions are way out of date. So instead of trying to force all of this onto towns, that is not working. And the towns are going to fail, not because they're not trying, they are trying. And I can speak from experience. This type of state mandate is not going to help anybody with affordable housing. I view it that what really should be done is we should stop with these mandates, really look at why 830G is not working the way that people thought it was going to work in different parts of the state. Understand what each town is doing. And I can tell you, in my part of the state, towns are working very much to try to make things as affordable as one can, as attainable as one can. But also realize that if we're going to look to see what to do with affordable housing, partner with the towns and the cities, and then you can start creating rules once you get all the stakeholders involved. This is actually trying to keep 830G going and trying to make it change, knowing that it's not going to work. I can tell you, for me as a state senator, I'm not supportive of these types of efforts because I've never seen top-down mandates work. I've never seen trying to pound a square peg in a round hole work. You spend a lot of time and effort and everybody gets frustrated. I continue to advocate for a different way so we can really try to see what we can do for affordable housing all throughout the state. And just one last point is, if you look at some of the legislation that's been proposed, and some of these bills are huge numbers of pages long, very dense reading, you're creating more state bureaucracy, more state mandates, unfunded mandates on towns to come up with annual reports, for example, on affordable housing. That why does a town have to do that, for example, or attest to certain things, and if it can't meet certain benchmarks, it gets punished. That's, again, no way for a state to try to help facilitate what the towns are already doing. And at the end of the day, and I tell people this all the time, it's not the state that is driving affordable housing. It's what's happening in each of the communities. Economic development, the character of the town, quality of life in the town, the school systems, tax structure, things like that, infrastructure, the police, the fire, EMS, the roads. This is what happens in the towns.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I do want to move to Fred Camillo, who's here. Again, sorry for the tech issues, Fred, but glad that you were able to join. You were the first selectman of Greenwich. You also were a state representative for many years, so you know a lot of the different aspects of our government. What's your reaction to hearing the comments from Francis on the impact on a municipality if fair share were to pass? What would that impact look like for Greenwich?
Well, it certainly would be a huge setback. I mean, each of the 169 municipalities are different. The senator's right. I mean, you know, he has many towns within his jurisdiction there, and they're all different. They're very different from my town. here, but we have been working really hard, and Francis outlined all of the issues at stake here in this bill, and not unlike other bills, but this one here, coming under the guise of a compromise, really is just as bad as the original, I believe. And towns like Greenwich, we were at 5.3% for a while, and now we got up to 5.8, with plans to get up to 6.7% when we're done with some renovations. And that's a key point. We have a lot of older units that were built in the 50s that are not counted. They're affordable. They're not counted because they haven't had more than $25,000 put into them in the last 30 years. And we're doing that now. We're finishing up a huge project that's going to get us several hundred. We have a few more on tap. Those alone should get us to 67% in the next few years. We have some other ideas about developing things on flat surfaces, surface parking lots, not taking away open space, because again, that's people who on one hand talk about preserving open space, and then they want to take it and put unit after unit after unit on it, and especially when you consider the flooding issues we're all having. That's just a non-starter for us. So we're going to continue to do it the way we know best, which I believe all the other towns are doing. They know their towns certainly better than legislators in Hartford. And, I've invited people in the past when we were debating to come to Greenwich who were for 830G, and they had no idea about how many units we had, how diverse the town was, and all the progress we've made. Even the governor has said several times, Greenwich doesn't need Hartford mandates because we're doing it on our own. And so I think I would just, hope that everybody reaches out to people in the legislature, especially certain towns where, this is not going to be that popular, but where some legislators may be being pressured to vote for it, and just let them know what's at stake. Because as you heard, we don't want to go down the same path as New Jersey has. And that's exactly what's going to happen if they continue with this.
Thanks, Fred. And I see the rest of our panelists have come in. Catherine Braun, an environmental attorney and a member of the Zoning Commission here in Fairfield, and Matthew Mandel, a Westport RTM member. He's also chairman of the P&Z subcommittee on the RTM. Kathy, environmental issues have been a big concern for you. Can you talk about what mass density looks like in our towns from an environmental standpoint? Does the state have goals in terms of preserving open space?
Yes. In fact, the state has a goal of preserving 21% of all the land that exists as open space, about half of that at the town level and half of it at the state level. And according to the commission, the State Commission on Environmental Quality, it will take us 65 years to achieve that goal because of how slow it is going. It's very difficult, as you can imagine. You have development pressure, you have rules and regulations, you have budget issues, and you have a lot of development pressure. Now you have laws like this that are we're constantly fighting back on these bills. The bills that I've viewed in general have almost no accommodation for open space. There are bills that have carve-outs for things like wetlands, but even those are usually vaguely worded or incomplete. And there's nothing ever carved out that I can see for open space that's not already preserved by easement or by dedication as open space. There's plenty of open space out there we need to preserve. Add to that the issue of climate change, and not just coastal communities, but other communities will all be affected by flooding, by drought, by water supply, drinking water supplies. Open space helps with all of that. And if I've just done a lot of research on it, but forested areas provide what they call ecological services, which actually we should be paying for. We should pay people to preserve forested land undisturbed because it cleans the water, cleans the air, it sequesters carbon dioxide, and it also provides flood control and drought control. And I believe in the future, we're going to have to expand our wetlands protective buffers and our water company protective buffers to keep the water clean. And we're not doing that. And if we allow these laws to pass, these bills to pass, we're going to lose the open space we have. There's no one goal should not supersede the other goal. The need for affordable housing should not supersede the need to protect open space and to plan for our environmental health into the future.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Matt Mandel, good to see you. So, again, sorry about the tech issues. Gotta love the Zoom world. But want to give you the floor because I know you've been very passionate about your community of Westport, and you've been very outspoken against the fair share bill and against some of the TOD bills like Live, Work, Ride. Tell us your standpoint, where you come from, and why you arrived at this decision.
Well, there are numerous reasons why. Essentially, Westport has been, as Fred Camillo was talking about, Greenwich working very hard to create affordable housing, and we've done a magnificent job. We have inclusionary zoning. It's the standard in the state, which is 20%. So anytime you want to build affordable housing or any kind of housing in the town, you have to apply 20% of it as affordable. So Westport is not getting the credit that it's due. And then we've created a standout affordability plan under 830J, and took our efforts, put it together, and we're willing to do this. But yet we now have the state coming down and saying we need to do fair share, we need to do Live, Work, Ride, and it basically supersedes the whole concept of us working on it on our own. But let's talk about what the bills actually are going to do. There has been no feasibility study for Live, Work, Ride or for fair share. There's been no economic impact study to see what would they be doing. We're essentially talking about playing with tens of billions of dollars of property value throughout the state. And what will happen to it? Will it go up? Will it go down? And when you start paying for all these things to build all the housing, and housing's costing about $500,000 a unit at this point. So when you're spending all of this money, what is that going to do to the underlying economic structure of the towns? And what will that do to taxes in that case? And I'd suggest that the people who are just hanging on, the people who are working the hardest, the working class, the lunch pail crew that own houses and are working on it are going to get priced out. And that's something I think that we should all be looking at as well. As a Democrat, it sort of pains me to think that the people who are major supporters of the Democratic Party are the working class group are going to be priced out by what occurs here. Because if they can't afford to live in the towns any longer because the infrastructure needs cost so much, you're going to be sending them out. So I think there needs to be some kind of study to see what will happen. We can't have people just voting and saying, oh, this is a wonderful idea, we should do it. Yes, it's a wonderful idea. We should be creating affordable housing. Westport wants to create affordable housing, but not 2,000 units. And how could it be done? You can't just ram that down people's throats and not realize what will the future impact be? Will it be good or bad? Now, we could talk about economic impacts. We could talk about environmental impacts as well. But it's a whole group of things. Why doesn't the legislature sit back and try to figure out what would occur if we do this before they pull the trigger and say, yes, let's do it?
Yeah, thank you. Now we have some questions from the audience. We have some, I guess one person has a question about where is the proof about do we need this much affordable housing? Francis, you said earlier that we probably wouldn't need that many because we don't anticipate our population going up that high. But where are the numbers coming from?
So if you look at the fair share bill, and they've cited various numbers, generally around 90,000 to 150,000 households in Connecticut pay an unsustainable fraction of their household income to rent or mortgage. And these people are called housing burden. And the data on this is relatively solid. I don't think that I would dispute that there are people who are suffering because their incomes are out of proportion to what their housing costs are. The question is how you solve that. So if somebody comes to you and says, I'm having trouble making my rent or paying my mortgage, is the solution to help them pay their rent or pay their mortgage? Or is it to build a brand new house somewhere else in the States? Generally, the cheapest solution is the best solution. The cheapest solution are often the same. And in this case, it is helping them with their rent or mortgage. Unfortunately, Fair Share doesn't do that. What Fair Share does is it confuses people who are facing challenges paying their rent or mortgage but are not homeless with the need for additional housing. We have about 3,000 homeless people in Connecticut. That's 3,000 too many. But we generally are considered to have the lowest rate of homelessness in the entire country. We've done a very good job of housing unsheltered people. So there is a demand for additional units but the demand is not 100,000 or 150,000. Arguably, it's maybe 3,000, 5,000, 10,000. I think it's really important not to confuse housing affordability with homelessness.
Anybody else on the panel want to add to that?
Yeah, this is Jeff Gordon. I'll quickly add to it, and I agree with what's been said. But one thing that also at times doesn't get discussed in this is when we talk about overall affordability of where people live, it's just not housing. It's what is going on overall with the high cost of living in this state. And I hear that from a lot of people, in my part of the state who are trying to pay their property taxes, for example, and maintain a home, and then they're pushed and pulled in many directions with what limited money they may have, especially if they're a retiree or a young family. So there's a lot of components to this. It's not as simple as you start building a lot of these affordable houses all around the state and magically people are going to be able to afford it. It's one thing to build these houses in towns to be able to afford to support them with infrastructure, but also people who need affordable housing, can they actually afford to live in this state? And that's a bigger discussion that's happening in the legislature, and I'm glad to be a part of that. But we shouldn't lose sight of that because it's just not as simple as build the houses and people will come and it magically gets solved. It's one piece of a much bigger puzzle that we really need to get a better handle on when we're talking about long-term sustainability in this state.
Yeah. Kathy, I know you want to add to that.
Yeah. I've long questioned the figure, and so it could be 90,000 or it could be 150,000. That's a huge difference. 90 is a lot less than 150. But aside from that, I've tried to find the raw data, and maybe Francis could get it to me after this forum, but I've not been able to really find the raw data. I need to know what's in that figure. If we're off, well, then the crisis might be half of what we think it is. And so all of these bills are being driven by the need for 6 figures of new affordable housing. I need to know, I think it comes from census data, but I don't understand who is in the database. Is it people at a higher income level that just are paying more because they choose to? And also, does it include utilities? Utilities, I think, are usually included in the cost of housing. And if so, that's something that can change next year based on what Eversource does. And why can't we come up with another way to help those people rather than if they're paying too much because of utilities, that's a different issue than not having enough housing. So maybe somebody else who more technical can address that.
Yeah, Kathy, I can answer that. So this data is collected by the Census Bureau. It's self-reported data by homeowners and residents. It does bounce around somewhat because it's a sample. So you will see swings from quarter to quarter. So last quarter, we saw that Connecticut for one quarter had the tightest rental market in the country. And then the next quarter, it was average. So I do take it with a grain of salt. It's better to look, to average the data over more time. So the margins of error or the confidence intervals decrease. But you're absolutely right that they do consider utilities in this. So anything that reduces utility costs is a plus for housing affordability. They do not consider transportation costs. And that's something that Jeff Gordon spoke to. If you can get by without a car, that's about 20% of your income you'll save right there. So housing near transit is key to helping people reduce their total costs. Unfortunately, they don't consider transportation. They do consider property taxes. And if you look at the state of Connecticut as a whole, the state varies dramatically by region. As a whole, Connecticut housing is relatively affordable compared to our income levels. I'm talking broad strokes here. This is the medians. What sets us apart is when you layer on top the energy costs and the property taxes. Then we pull ahead. But when you pull those out, the house itself is not that expensive on a state median.
Thank you. All All right, more questions from this audience who's very engaged. I might pick on Francis again. Speaking of transportation, can you briefly explain the Live Work Ride bill?
Yeah, so Live Work Ride. So fair share for those who are policy wonks or bill hounds is House Bill 6633. Live Work Ride is House Bill 6890. Now, Live Work Ride's premise is that we need to build more housing, and the housing should be located near transit, because if you can get by without a car, you can save a lot of money, have more disposable income, which is absolutely correct. Where Live Work Ride goes off the proverbial rails is that it confuses there being some transit in a municipality with having high quality transit. So Live Work Ride says if a bus stops anywhere in your town once a day, then that town needs to rezone for higher density. And we know as a transportation planner, that's hogwash. Transit-oriented development only works when the transit runs to where you need to go. So if a bus stops once a day across town, doesn't take you to your job, your school, your bank, your doctor, et cetera, it's useless to you. And nobody's going to get in a car and drive to a local city bus. They might drive to an express bus, but not to a local city bus. In fact, Live Work Ride goes beyond that and says if a bus stops anywhere in a neighboring town, you have to rezone. So the bus stop might be 10 miles away, and yet your town has to rezone for higher densities, which generally can only be accommodated by public water and public sewer, or a miniaturized version of that called an alternative treatment system. These are all very expensive to build and maintain. They're beyond the capabilities of homeowner associations to maintain. So it's setting up standards that don't really work in practice. If we are going to do transit-oriented development, we really need to pull it back and focus on the high-quality transit, the commuter rail and the bus rapid transit, and not the bus that goes through town once or twice a day.
Thanks, Francis.
Alexis, may I continue?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Live Work Ride. Well, there are a couple of aspects of Work Ride. Francis talked about where it's located, but it doesn't address affordability. And that's the funny thing about it, which is, the whole concept here, we're supposed to be creating affordable housing, but they don't have affordability kick in until you build 10 units on an acre. So any developer in a more wealthy community is going to bypass that and just build 9 and 9 again and 9 again and 9 again. And what will happen is they're just going to look to densify the area, take their money and run, and not actually create any affordability. So that's a gigantic miss in Live Work Ride. The other aspect is as Francis talked about, along the commuter rail, but we're talking essentially Metro North. But if you look at the DEP's own information, their own maps, and talking about global warming and sea rise, it's going to be all along the Metro North corridor. Essentially, if you look at Westport specifically, within 20 years at high tide, the train itself might be inaccessible. So is this exactly where we're supposed to be densifying and putting all of this infrastructure in and all of these people, if in the end, global warming is just going to wipe out all of this area? So that's a big problem. The other aspect is the goal of Live, Work, Ride, and Desegregate Connecticut has said numerous times, is to build enough density and build enough housing that it will ultimately upset the infrastructure, the underlying property value infrastructure, to then drop all prices down so that there's more affordability that way, naturally occurring. But in doing that, you're definitely buckling the underlying property values of the people who currently live there. And again, it comes back to that same argument I gave before, that the very people who have made it and are working hard to stay there are going to be the first ones to get it in the neck. And that's the problem. That's where we need to look at what will happen if these things do occur. I mean, I could go on for a lot more, but I think they got more questions.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that Work, Live, Ride is an opt-in. And towns that don't opt in, they would face the termination of various brownfield remediation funding.
Well, that's not really an opt-in, is it? An opt-in is saying, hey, do you want to do it or don't you want to do it? This way it says you want to do it or don't want to do it, but if you don't want to do it, we're going to cut off all your money. That's not really an opt-in. That's a twist your arm in. And I have no problem if any particular town wants to do it and go for it, they should be able to. And I think the state should help them do it. But towns that have other ideas in doing it, such as Westport and how we're creating affordable housing, we shouldn't be forced to do it. And I think that's where the opt-in should really be an opt-in. And I think they should be looking at how to create real affordability and not allowing developers just to be able to come in and build what they want and leave without giving this town or the affordability any, say.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt, for adding to that. Then, Fred, I want to go back to you because, it seems to me that Work, Live, Ride actually punishes towns who have actually taken great initiatives when it comes to transit-oriented development. I know a number of towns have done that in Connecticut. What's the story with TOD in Greenwich?
Well, we around our train station, especially our main one in Greenwich, we have lots of multifamily homes, lots within walking distance of the train. So these TOD bills that were there, going to mandate, how many certain amount of units per acre, I think it's 15, basically outlawing single family zoning, especially where our train station is located right near the water. And we're already having an issue with flooding like every other, of the other 168 municipalities. So it's every way you turn on this, these are bad bills and bad ideas. And again, and I agree with Matt, it just ends up hurting the people we're trying to help. And it prices them out, but it also puts a burden on everybody else. And it's by way of threat, basically they threaten you with these bills. And we just have to reach out to the legislators all around the state and give them the facts and talk about what's happened in New Jersey and talk about the successes. It's not always protesting and saying these are bad bills. It's talking about what we're doing and all the success stories we have. And that is, I think, the way to lead for the towns like where the senator represents. Yeah, some of them, he's right. What are you going to do? Their jobs aren't there. Their infrastructures aren't set up for it. So it's almost, pretty obvious where it looks like the towns are being set up to fail. And, all they're going to do is put everybody in court for a long, long, long time, long after the legislators that are pushing this are gone from the legislature.
Questions here. Now, can someone talk more about the litigation aspect of fair share and who would have standing? I know, Francis, you talked about that in the beginning, but can you go back to that? I think that's something people want to really dive into.
Yeah, so it's an interesting model. Fair share emerged out of a court case in New Jersey in 1975. A series of court cases went to their Supreme Court called the Mount Laurel cases. And they have a different constitution than we do. This has not been litigated and kind of the same outcome in Connecticut. There have been about 40 years of litigation in New Jersey on fair share. It's been essentially continual since it went into effect. And generally speaking, to sue a town, you have to sue anybody in court, you have to have standing. Standing is a fundamental principle of our legal system. And you have to have suffered an actual injury and sue for it. Fair share would essentially say affordable housing advocates and the developers of affordable housing would not have to suffer any injury. In fact, they would not even have to be involved in a town. They would be automatically granted standing and could sue the town if the requisite housing units are not built, even if it's not the town's fault they haven't been built. So it basically gives them if somebody tried to sue a town right now on these grounds, they would be thrown out for lack of standing. And that's what's so concerning about it. And there's an incentive for, as I mentioned before, the targets that are set for the towns are completely unrealistic. Even the private sector couldn't meet them right now. Even if you paid every developer in Connecticut, you probably could not meet them. So they've set up unrealistic targets. Fair share does provide attorney's fees for the plaintiffs in the cases. And the plaintiff could be an affordable housing developer, and the court could order the town then to hire that developer to build the housing. So it's a really concerning model with respect to good governance. What's not clear in the bill is whether the plaintiffs could also receive punitive damages. And given what we're talking about here in terms of the housing costs, those could also be quite substantial. So it's not an improvement to our court system. I'll leave it that way.
Someone has a question on vouchers. We've heard that term come up a few times this session. Are there any bills being voted on right now that would increase accessibility to housing vouchers? Jeff or Francis, would you know that?
I'd have to take a look at the list. I have a list of thousands of bills in front of me that's coming up. I don't recollect. I mean, one of the issues is, again, how much is the state trying to support people who legitimately need help with housing? I'd have to take a look at those bills. But even with whatever the state might be wanting to do, this type of approach is going to be so overwhelmingly expensive for everybody. And again, it's going to be put onto the backs of towns, unfunded mandates on towns and cities, that it's going to just be outright unsustainable. But I'd have to take a look at some of the list of bills regarding vouchers, but it hasn't been something that's popped up when I've been trying to scroll through a long list of bills right now just to see what there is on that. But if I can just say one quick word to follow up on what Francis said about lawsuits. For small towns or any town, lawsuits are massively expensive. I can tell you, as a planning and zoning commissioner, we take great pains to make certain we're crossing the T's, dotting the I's, doing everything we're supposed to be doing legally, because you don't want to be sued. Towns just can't afford that. This upends it and makes it easy to sue towns. And what will happen is towns that are not going to be able to fund a defense, and I can see my towns in my district not being able to afford that. They're just going to throw up their hands and say, fine, we have no choice. We just have to go with whatever, is being, pushed on us, because we have no way to fund a fight, even if the towns are in the right. And that's a terrible way to set public policy. Is to threaten towns with expensive lawsuits. You're going to create a bad product, and that's not what we want for public policy.
On the voucher issue, vouchers are, economists like vouchers because they put the power in the hands of the people who need housing, and they can decide where to live. The challenge with vouchers, many of you have probably seen that 50% of the vouchers in Connecticut go unused for various reasons, and that's unacceptable. Even if they were used, we have two issues with vouchers. One is there are not enough vouchers. The wait list is huge. In fact, there are wait lists across the state because we don't have one statewide wait list, which just boggles the mind. The second thing is with the increase in housing costs, which is really not arguably driven by zoning. Zoning in many towns hasn't changed for decades. It's been driven by the market and by inflation and many other factors. The vouchers have not kept up with housing costs. Much of the voucher money comes from Washington. It's a federal issue. There are also state voucher programs. Some of the bills do speak to getting more landlords to accept vouchers, and landlords are supposed to have to accept vouchers. They don't always do so. But what we really need to do is infuse more resources into the voucher program so we have more vouchers. They're easier to get, and they cover the actual cost of housing.
If I might add to the concept of lawsuits, I mean, the corollary is that the towns then sue the state. Because in New Jersey, you've got 9 towns already suing over what's going on over there. So these pieces of legislation are just going to create a lot of animosity rather than sitting down and figuring out how to work with the towns to try to solve the problem. There's a problem that exists that needs to be worked out, but this isn't the way to create this adversarial situation that's going to be occurring.
Kathy, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just a little bit adding on. I appreciate what everybody else has said about the litigation, but they define the bill defines interested party as a nonprofit organization, not an organization that made an application for a project that was rejected, or a housing developer that seeks to construct housing contributing to the fair share quota if the intended or proposed development complies with basically 8-30G laws. I think this whole law is kind of an end run on 8-30G and sort of putting 8-30G on steroids. So if people don't like 8-30G in their community, where a developer can go in and propose anything they want and completely ignore all zoning laws, this is worse. This is far worse. It gives people standing if they haven't even applied for a project. Not a good way to do litigation. When you don't have the harm, you don't have the skin in the game, you can just sue the town because they didn't do enough C of O's, certificate of occupancy, to get to the milestones they have along the 10-year path.
To add to that, when you talk that it has to be like an 830G, 830G is a 70-30 split between market rate and affordability. Fair share changes it to 80-20. So what developer would do any 830G at this point anymore if they could step in under fair share and make it 80-20? The developers are making 10% more of the unit's market rate and putting it in their pockets. So it's an interesting thing that's occurring. I mean, apparently from what I was finding out in working on the different subcommittees for the affordable housing subcommittee was that a lot of them are scared of inclusionary zoning because they don't believe developers want to step in and do it. And so now here's the proof is that 70-30 split is being tossed out the window and making it 80-20 and driving it forward from there. And as you said, it's just, anybody can do it. And if you think 830G is scary, this makes 830G look like child's play.
Jeff, can you talk about where we are in the process? The legislature ends in early June, I believe. And I know that you don't have insight on every committee and everything going on because I know that you have your own priorities. But can you tell us where we are with the housing bills, zoning bills in particular, if you know?
Well, right now, you're right. The session is supposed to end in early June by state law. So right now, more and more, the House, the Senate is in session, taking up huge numbers of bills. That's what makes the day and the nights in the sessions long, given the huge volume of bills. And many times the agendas don't come out until the night before, the morning of. So definitely stay tuned to see exactly where a lot of these bills work their way, but also be mindful that there may be lots of amendments discussed to try to, correct, so to speak, bad parts of a bill or try to stop a bill or try to add something good to a bill. So right now, a lot of these bills are still working their way to get to the floor. I know the Senate goes into session on Tuesday. So I've been busy with my legislative aid trying to find out what bills are going to come up because I have a stack of things to want to either talk about or work with people on. But one thing I just want to remind people of, and this is extremely important for the process, is just because a bill is written a certain way when it came out of committee doesn't mean that may be the exact wording that's going to hit the floor or what actually ends up getting voted upon throughout a debating and discussion and amendment process. So it is a type of thing that you really want to talk with your legislator about. You all have state rep, you all have a state senator. Call he or she, discuss your concerns, let them know what you think. Do not assume someone's going to do it for you. Or don't let somebody speak for you, because when it comes to making local decisions in your town, that is your right. You know best about what's best for your town. So speak up. I know some of my fellow panelists talked about wanting to make certain that senators and representatives hear from people. This, if you haven't already done so, this is a key time to do so, because once these bills start hitting the floor, that's not a time to start trying to track down your senator or representative. So by all means, email, send a letter. You see he or she out and about in the district, call the office. There's multiple ways to get through, but the more that we can hear from people, the better. I can tell you when I'm out and about in my 13 towns and talk with people about this, number one, a lot of people don't realize this is stuff happening. They're busy with their own lives, but once they do, they have a lot of concerns and questions, and I'm there as a state senator to hear and talk with them. So definitely take advantage of having your voice heard so we can see what we can do to make things better, not worse, with what I think a lot of these bills are going to move things in a bad direction.
Yeah, and a big plug for CT 169 too. We have a
Absolutely.
website with lots of information on the bills, how to contact your legislator, because as Jeff said, the time is now. And please don't wait. Francis, how can residents use the COGS? How can the COGS be a resource to folks? I know that you're out there and you educate so many people on the bills. Not everybody is like that, but how can the COGS, I guess, be a resource for us?
Well, we have 9 regional councils of governments, and our jobs is to bring together the mayors and first selectmen of all the communities to discuss matters of common concern. And anything that would increase property taxes 20%, in my book, is an issue of common concern, if not an emergency. Every COG operates differently. You can check out their websites. Our meetings are open to the public, but really your conduit to the COG is through your mayor or first selectman. If you want to have something brought up at your COG, please talk to your mayor or first selectman.
Thank you. I know we're coming up to the 8 o'clock hour. I know we started a little late, but I wanted to open up to the floor to our panelists. Is there anything else that we did not touch on in this 45-minute conversation that you guys want to bring up? I'd love to open up to all of you.
I would just appeal to people who are listening. And if there are any legislators on it, do some research. Look at it and look at it holistically, and not just buy into the dog and pony shows that are saying that this is the right thing to do because it's a good thing to do. Think about it in the long term of what actually will be occurring. What will be the impacts to the people who are already there? What will be the impacts to the state and what the state is going to have to spend in the future to take care of mistakes that might come out? We don't know what the indirect consequences are going to be. Think about those, because without looking at it that way, and you just say, hey, we're going to do it, 10 years from now, we might be in a very bad situation. And the state may not be in as good a footing as it is right now. It may be much worse. Think about it that way. That's what I would say to people.
Yeah.
If I can just quickly follow up on that, that's extremely important because if you start building these things and you don't have forethought and foresight and you just march ahead, yes, unintended consequences seem to happen all the time, but we're talking about use of land and effects in people's neighborhoods and communities and towns. That is not something you can easily undo, especially if it starts affecting natural resources. And there are a lot of small rural towns that depend upon those natural resources for their water supply, for example, and don't have public water. So that's why I'm an advocate for saying, why is there this rush? We all support promoting and supporting reasonable and responsible affordable housing, but don't rush it. We should take a pause right now, not create more mandates, get all the stakeholders together, work with every town and city and see what we can actually do before you start doing something. And then you turn around and say, well, it didn't work. We made a lot of mistakes. So now let's figure out what to do. That's a terrible situation to put people in.
Yeah, it is. Catherine, did you want to say something?
Sure, yeah. I just want to say that land is not what we call a fungible good. It's not exchangeable. Money is. You can help people with their utility bills, but once you take away the land, it can't be replaced. And it goes along with what everybody else has been saying. I do challenge the amount that is claimed to be needed because I do believe it includes things like utility bills. On the other side of the equation, you have land that's going to become increasingly scarce and resources like drinking water that are going to need more protection, not less. So you have a double whammy right there, more need to protect more land, but more pressure to take away the land. I think open space cannot take a back seat to the need for affordable housing, and we need to verify the numbers first.
Yeah, well said. Yes, and land is the most finite resource that we do have, and it would be great to see more environmentalists, take, some stronger stances on these bills. It is a minute past 8 o'clock. I want to be sensitive to everybody. Sunday night. This is a really great conversation. I want to thank you all for being here, for the audience for being here. And please write your legislators, no matter how you feel, if it's good, bad, and different. I mean, just get engaged and do your research. CT169, CT169strong.org. Lots of information on there. Get involved. Thank you again. Have a great night.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay. Talk soon.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye.